Hello, everybody. Can everybody hear me? Is this doing anything?
Yes, sir.
Okay.
Oh, we can hear you. But we can hear you from there.
Okay. I may just talk.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I can project. Good acoustics. That's what you did there. So welcome, everybody. So first of all, my name is Matt Fullerton. I'm with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And I'll let Georgia introduce herself.
I'm also with the Fish and Wildlife Service, Georgia Riggs. I'm our office's renewable energy coordinator out of the Tulsa Ecological Services field office.
Yeah. And I work out of the Southwest Regional Office, which covers the states of Oklahoma, Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona. And I work on bats and renewable energy for basically the whole Southwest region. So I'm like, I have kind of things going on in multiple states and across the U.S. And we also have
Richard Stark, and I oversee a National Wildlife Refuge in eastern Oklahoma called Ozark Plateau National Wildlife Refuge. And we were established to help protect federally listed endangered cave species, including bats. So thank you for having me.
Yeah, so we're going to kind of go over some background on some of the endangered bats. Well, first of all, we'll kind of just talk about sort of some bats in general for the state, and then we'll kind of go into some of the endangered bats we have, including bats that are found in this area, and then we'll kind of go into talking a little bit about wind energy, its impacts on bats, and also kind of what our agency's role is with, these sorts of reviews and processes. So I want to first start out with what is our role. And so for the purposes of this meeting, we are here to share information in the most unbiased way possible. So we do not advocate for or against wind energy development or really any kind of development on the landscape. Our role is to work with agencies, project proponents, public and private industry to reduce, minimize, and mitigate when needed impacts to federally listed and federal trust species. So federally listed species include like species that are listed under the Endangered Species Act, that can be threatened or endangered, and then we also have species that are federal trust species, which would be like migratory birds or bald and golden eagles. And so, of course, we use the best available science in our decision making, kind of all the work that we do and all of our various analyses and reviews. So a little bit about Oklahoma bats. Bats are really cool, right? So we have at least 23 species of bats native to the state. Bats are found in every county of the state and are very adaptable, very wide-ranging. They occupy a wide diversity of habitat types. You can find bats in close canopy forests and prairies and wetlands, and then also heavily urbanized areas. They can find themselves in attics and buildings, and even like roadway bridges and culverts. They're very adaptable in where they roost, and they can, a lot of times they're in people's backyards and they're not even aware that they're there. So it's really cool. And as many people know, bats use echolocation to navigate and find their food. So they rely on sound waves that bounce off of objects in their environment, whether it's a moth they're trying to chase, or they're trying to keep from hitting an object, or another bat, or a tree, or a building. So they use echolocation as their sight. Bats are not blind, contrary to popular belief. Bats can see, but that's their primary use for navigation is echolocation. And some bats are migratory. It's kind of like birds. So we have some bats that are only here during summer, or even just during spring and fall, moving from like winter to summer grounds. And then we also have some bats that are here year-round. And so we have currently 4 federally listed endangered bats in the state. And then we have, and those are listed there, we have the gray bat, the Ozark big-eared bat, northern long-eared bat, and the Indiana bat. And then we also have the tricolored bat, which is currently proposed as endangered, which means that our agency is doing a review right now to determine whether or not it meets the definition of endangered. So the first 2 endangered bats I'll talk about are the gray bat and Ozark big-eared bat. And these 2 bats are what we call cave obligate bats. So they use caves year-round. So there's caves that they hibernate in, there's different caves that they raise their young in, but they require caves year-round. And the gray bat mainly occurs in Oklahoma during the summer season. So they're here, they use certain caves to raise their young in the summer, and then in the winter, I would say over 95% of our gray bats leave the state in the winter, and they hibernate in caves in the eastern U.S. So like in states like Missouri, Arkansas, Kentucky, there's large congregations of gray bats and certain caves they go to there. And then we have caves here in the summer that they use. And so it's interesting, bats are very selective about the characteristics they look for in a roost that they use, whether it be a cave or a tree or whatever it is. It's got to have kind of the right features and climate conditions for that period of their life. Secondly, the Ozark big-eared bat is similar to the gray bat. It's also a cave obligate. However, they are what I would call like a homebody. I mean, they pretty much, they stay kind of in a very small radius year-round. Their range is pretty restricted in the state. And the Ozark big-eared bat is the rarest bat in Oklahoma and probably the rarest bat in the United States. I mean, there's the total population, which is found in Oklahoma and Arkansas, is just around 2,000 individuals. And they've historically always been rare. And they feed primarily on moths. So they're like a moth specialist. And we actually, when we're trying to find evidence of Ozark big-eared bats in, say, a cave, we will look for moth wings, at the bottom of the cave. That kind of tells us, okay, we've never actually seen a bat here, but there's evidence that Ozark big-eared bats have used this cave. So most of the known colonies of Ozark big-eared bats are in Adair and Sequoyah counties. And then as far as gray bats, we've got some significant maternity caves in Delaware County, Cherokee County, and Ottawa County. And so I've got these bats grouped together because these are bats that roost primarily in trees in the summer. So I'll start with the northern long-eared bat. So the northern long-eared bat roosts under the bark or the crevices of trees during summer. And then they hibernate in caves and mines. And really all three of these hibernate in caves generally. And the northern long-eared bat has been heavily impacted by a disease known as white nose syndrome, which I'll talk a little bit about here in a second. And so historically, northern long-eared bats were very abundant throughout the eastern U.S., including eastern Oklahoma. So pretty much it was one of the most common bats you could capture in eastern U.S. forests and eastern Oklahoma until white nose syndrome kind of came through, and they really declined significantly throughout most of their range. Secondly, the Indiana bat. So this is a bat that's not really found in this part of the state, but they're found in the southeast part of the state. And so in summer, they also roost in trees. But the trees they look for are a little different. They kind of like trees that are almost always dead. So a very large, mature, dead standing tree with exfoliating bark, bark that's kind of falling off. They like trees like that. They're kind of in an open area because they like kind of the exposure to sunlight when they raise their young. And so they're a little bit more selective with trees. And then we have historic records in the Ozarks, but the majority of our currently known population is in the southeast part of the state. And then lastly, the tricolored bat. So it's, I mentioned it's proposed as endangered. This bat is found almost statewide. It's definitely a generalist bat. I mean, it can occur in, forest limited and heavily forested landscapes. It likes to roost in leaf clusters of trees. So it's like you'll sometimes see the trees kind of like just like a hanging cluster of dead leaves. They like to kind of fly up and just sort of hang there. And really, a lot of people would just think they were a leaf if they saw it. We've got a picture later in the presentation to show you what that looks like. But yeah, we found them, they're statewide, and they're probably, of all the bats I've talked about so far, they're the one most likely to be found roosting in like a bridge or a culvert. So we've got a lot of records of them, roosting under highways, in bridges, kind of small culverts. So they can definitely take advantage of a lot of different sites for roosting. So here's kind of a general range map, kind of focused on the Ozarks, this part of the state, and where these bats occur. So this is not an end-all be-all range map. It just kind of generally shows you where these bats can be found. So the large sort of purple buffers, that's generally where our gray bat sites are, our significant gray bat caves. So you can see, kind of looking at the southwest corner of the county. Kind of goes into that, and then the black hashing is the northern long-eared bat range. You can kind of tease that out. Then the orange blobs here down in Adair County and Sequoyah, that's generally where most of our Ozark big-eared bat colonies are. And then it's hard to tell, but basically the rest of the map is just peppered, and that's the tricolored bat range because they're found essentially in every county in the state and over most of the eastern U.S. So you heard me mention a little bit ago about white nose syndrome. So You may have heard about white nose syndrome in the news, but it is a disease caused by an invasive fungal pathogen that thrives in cold and moist environments. And so what it does is it actually, it originates from Europe, and no one knows for sure how it got here, but what it does is it causes bats to kind of get this white growth on their nose, and it causes them to periodically wake up when they're hibernating, and they burn up their fat reserves, and they essentially starve to death. And so white nose syndrome has been the primary, single, most devastating thing to come in that has affected bat populations. So the northern long-eared bat has declined by well over 80 to 90% in many parts of its range. And I mentioned earlier, historically was one of the most abundant bats. Thankfully, this disease does not affect all bats equally. So Ozark big-eared bats aren't bothered by this disease, and the thought is because Ozark big-eared bats tend to wake up on their own throughout the winter, and they'll kind of forage sometimes and come out and drink. And so because they don't go into a real deep, traditional hibernation, they don't seem to be affected by white nose syndrome. Tricolored bats, they're susceptible to it, but I think that they've not as much as like the northern long-eared bat. And then the gray bat seems to be able to resist it okay. And, there's different theories as to why that is, and a lot of research has gone into that. The gray bat is a larger bodied bat, so there's sort of some thought that maybe that kind of helps it resist the effects of the disease. But the fungus that causes white nose was first detected in New York in 2006, I believe. And so basically just from there, it just sort of spread both from bat to bat transmission, and also just by people kind of spreading it on equipment and clothing. And so there's all kinds of research that's been ongoing with white nose syndrome, and kind of how to in developing treatments that can be used on wild bats. So our agency closely tracks white nose syndrome spread, and so this kind of shows a map, and we have a website, whitenosesyndrome.org, and I can give you more information on that if you're interested. But this kind of shows kind of the current spread map of white nose, and so the counties are basically color-coded according to the year that the fungus is detected. And so I believe it was first detected in 2015 in Oklahoma, and so you can see it spread into like South Texas, and most recently in places like New Mexico and West Texas. So those oranger and yellow colors are more recent, but the black X there is basically ground zero when the fungus was first detected in sort of the first caves in upstate New York. And you can kind of see here kind of what it looks like. It basically looks like like the bat ate a powdered donut or something, So it's really unusual to see in person, and some bats really, even though they get it, they can survive through the winter, but it just lowers their overall, essentially their viability and survival in general. And so we are seeing some, the nice thing is some populations seem to be kind of rebounding a little bit from white nose, especially up in closer to where white nose was first detected. Some of those bats, there was the initial decline, but some of those bats, the ones that have hung on, have survived, and the belief is maybe their genetics, they've developed sort of a genetic resistance to it. So there is some optimism to be had there. And now I'll turn it over to Georgia.
All right, so we've learned a lot so far. We've learned about how diverse the bats are in Oklahoma. They have lots of different life histories and behaviors. We have quite a diversity of bats in Oklahoma. And not only are bats impacted by stuff like white nose syndrome, bats are also really impacted by wind energy. So it turns out that bats collide with the moving blades of wind turbines when they're interacting with them in the airspace. And we oftentimes find bat carcasses at the bases of wind turbines, and this is a very active area of research, and we're learning a lot about how it works, the mechanisms, and what we can do to minimize and prevent bat deaths at wind projects. And so I want to tell you a little bit about how bats interact with wind turbines and what causes bats to collide. So we learned a lot already about how bats in Oklahoma have different life histories and behaviors. So bats these different life histories and behaviors cause bats to interact differently with wind turbines. So some species and groups are more vulnerable to colliding with wind turbines. And it turns out those migratory tree bats that Matt mentioned are the most vulnerable to
You can call me Bat, that's okay.
are the most vulnerable to collide with wind turbines. We tend to find them most often at the bases of wind turbines, and they are more affected than other types of bats. Another thing that influences bat deaths at wind turbines, and all of these different variables and factors interact as well. So while all of these different things impact bats and how they interact with wind turbines in one way, they also work together to influence rates of collisions as well. So time of year is really important. Again, that takes us back to an example of the migratory tree bats. Obviously they migrate, and fall tends to be the time of year that they are most often killed at wind projects. So all of these different species interact differently, and time of year plays a role. And then we also have wind speeds. So bats will generally only be in the airspace up to a certain wind speed, foraging and doing their bat stuff. And then when it gets too windy, they will kind of hunker down and not be in the airspace as much. And so obviously wind speed is really important for wind projects as well. And so that really plays a role in how bats are affected by wind projects as well. Another really important thing is where turbines are sited. So obviously on like the project scale and where projects are sited, across the state of Oklahoma, even there's a lot of differences, but even within a wind project, where you place turbines can be really important. So you want to consider, the different ways that bats use the habitat. So if we have bats that use caves, and we have caves where a wind project is, proposed to be built, it is really valuable to consider that when placing your turbines, because that plays a huge role in risk of collisions at wind projects as well. I also have turbine technology on here, and this has a question mark because this is changing very rapidly. Wind turbines are getting bigger. The technology is advancing, and these turbines are changing in size, and we're not exactly sure how this is going to change how bats interact with wind energy, but it will be really important that we stay on top of it and learn more about how bats interact as the technology changes. So fortunately, there are lots of things we can do to avoid and minimize risk to bats from wind projects. And this is a really cool photo because it's a bat with a wind project, a wind turbine in the background. A really great photo. So again, siting wind projects with bats in mind is really important to minimize, to avoid and minimize risk to bats. So siting areas away from those places that bats use heavily, such as caves where they hibernate and raise their young, forested areas, water resources where bats will congregate and use. If you consider the way bats use the habitat before developing a project, you can avoid risk to bats quite well. So that's really important when developing a wind project. And then also there are lots of ways that a wind project that's already built can operate to minimize risk to bats. So I already mentioned that bats are less likely to fly at high wind speeds, and wind projects, how they generally work is, the wind turbine blades can free spin, or they can be programmed to turn on at a certain wind speed. And so you can program a wind project to have all of the turbines not be free spinning and turn on at a certain wind speed. And so if you turn your project on at a certain wind speed when bats are less likely to be in the airspace, you can minimize the amount of time that bats and the wind turbines are interacting and minimize risk of mortality at your wind project. Let's see. And so generally, it's called curtailment, is when you change the speeds at which your wind project operates, generally turning the wind speed, having your project turn on at a certain wind speed is curtailing, And generally it's called blanket curtailment. And that means that all of the wind turbines at a project will generally turn on at the same wind speed and will also be programmed, to increase the wind speed at which they turn on during a certain time of year. Times of year when risk is higher for bat mortality. So like during the fall migratory period when those tree roosting migratory species are in the area. And so that's blanket curtailment, and that is quite commonly used, but there's also lots of ongoing research in this area too on how to minimize risk to bats with wind projects. And one of those is called smart curtailment. And I think this is a really promising area of research, and I think more and more projects are going to start using it. But how it works is that you can put thermal cameras on the top of your wind turbine, and they collect bat data in real time. And so you have your real-time bat data, and you can turn off individual turbines in real time as well. And so it basically, when bats are in the airspace and at risk to collide with a wind turbine, the turbine will automatically turn off until the bat is out of the airspace. And so this is really cool because one of the issues with curtailment is, it can be a significant reduction in energy generation at the project. And so with this smart curtailment on an individual turbine by turbine basis, you can really increase your power generation. And so turbines aren't necessarily turned off when there may not be bats in the airspace. And so it's kind of a win-win situation. And there are some barriers currently to this kind of technology and this smart curtailment approach. And generally that's technology costs. It can be difficult, the technology is expensive, it can be difficult to install technology on turbines, sometimes it voids warranties. So there are some barriers, but smart curtailment is becoming more popular, and we're getting more and more information on its effectiveness, and it seems to be rather effective. Another thing that is being researched is acoustic deterrence. And this is something that needs more work than smart curtailment. There's less that we know about its effectiveness, but how it works is you place a device on the top of your wind turbine and it puts out a certain frequency. And each species of bat is tuned into certain frequencies, and so depending on your bat species and the frequency that's coming out of your device, some bats have been found to be deterred from the area, and so that minimizes the risk of bats colliding because they stay away from that rotor swept zone where they are more likely to collide. And some issues with this is that, again, it's kind of species specific, so we have a lot more to learn, but some research has also shown that some bat species are attracted to certain frequencies, and so there's a lot more work that needs to be done on researching acoustic deterrence, but there is some promise there, and it's an area of active research. So there's a lot of things we can do to minimize risk to bats and also avoid risk to bats when developing a wind project. Okay, so now I want to get into the Fish and Wildlife Service and what we do when it comes to wind projects in Oklahoma. So in Oklahoma, wind projects are built primarily on private property, and they're built by private entities. And so because this is the case, the Fish and Wildlife Service can provide technical assistance to project developers and project operators. We encourage them to come to us as early as possible so we can provide the best technical assistance to them using the information that they provide us about their proposed project and our knowledge of federally threatened and endangered species. In the end, because these projects are privately funded and built on private property, it is the project developer that assumes the risk of impacting federally threatened and endangered species. We do what we can to provide technical assistance and to inform them of what they can do to avoid and minimize impacts to federally listed species. But in the end, it is up to them to take responsibility, and that is how it works. We have the wind energy guidelines that the Fish and Wildlife Service developed in 2012, and they have been really valuable and provide a kind of framework to help wind developers develop as responsibly as possible and to avoid and minimize their impacts and risk to federally threatened and endangered species. It's a tiered approach, and it has kind of become the standard. So basically every wind developer knows about this, and they come to us, usually having done some of these approaches already, and some of these, some of the stuff contained in the wind energy guidelines for bats specifically could look like, some of the stuff we've talked about already, siting your turbines away from known bat areas, summer roosting habitat, hibernacula, these areas that are important for bats that they regularly use. Some other things that are contained in the wind energy guidelines include pre-construction surveys, such as acoustic surveys for bats or live capture methods as well. And these are really great to inform, developers of where these important bat areas might be. So the more information that we have, the more information that they have, the better they can make a decision to create their wind project in a responsible way that minimizes impacts to federally listed species. The last thing I'll mention from the wind energy guidelines is post-construction monitoring surveys as well. And this is pretty much the standard. Usually after wind projects are developed, they will conduct a year of post-construction mortality monitoring surveys to see the actual impacts of their project. Because we can only learn so much before a project is built. These post-construction mortality monitoring surveys give us some really good information about the actual impacts of a wind project. Okay, so that was a lot of information, and now I'm going to give you more information. But I'm going to take you through kind of like a step-by-step of how it works and how when wind project developers come to us, what we can do and how it works in our office and what we're able to do. So, like I mentioned, these projects in Oklahoma are built on private property, which means it is up to the developer to assume risk and determine impacts to federally listed species. They come to us with information, project details, oftentimes survey information, and we have species-specific knowledge. We inform them of the potential risk of taking listed species. They use that information and they make a determination of the risk. So if they feel that the potential for risk to or impacts to federally listed species exist, they can voluntarily proceed with different options. Some of these include altering the project design to avoid impacts like we already talked about. They can do more surveys, gather more information. We already talked about that as well. If they feel that the risk is high and that they are potentially going to take a federally listed species, they can work with us on what is called a habitat conservation plan. And this is under Section 10.1B of the Endangered Species Act. And what that does is, it's a very long process, but it includes, actually I'll talk about that in the next slide. What it does is it allows them to obtain permits to legally take federally listed species. So we work with them to determine the amount of take they are allowed to have and allowed to be permitted, and it's a whole long process. There are lots of things involved. They also have to mitigate or offset the federally listed species that they take, even though they're permitted. So that is an option. Again, it is voluntary. The last thing they can do is do nothing and assume risk. And this means that if they take a federally listed species and they do not have a permit for it, it is illegal. They do not have permits, and it is up to them to make that decision of getting a permit or deciding not to and assuming risk. So, in summary, we inform non-federal project proponents like wind developers in Oklahoma as best as we can regarding the likelihood of impacts to federally listed species, but in the end, it is up to them what they decide to do. If they do decide to pursue a habitat conservation plan, we work with them. It's a very long process, and there are lots of agreed upon requirements, and this includes mitigation, like I mentioned, so offsetting the take that they are permitted of those federally listed species that they decide to get permits for. There's also monitoring requirements. Oftentimes these permit lengths are 30 years, and so they have to monitor to see if they are taking any of those species that they're permitted for, or maybe other species that they didn't expect to take. There's also adaptive management, which means if they do take a certain species, a listed species, or if they take more than they're permitted, they have to work with us to change stuff about their project to minimize risk and make things more legal. And all of these things are project and situationally specific, oh my goodness. And it's all very unique. This is how it works in Oklahoma. Different states are different. Some other states have state regulations, but this is how it works from the Fish and Wildlife perspective here in Oklahoma when we work with those private project developers. Okay, so we don't want to leave you feeling like there's nothing you can do. We want to empower you.
Yes.
And so we want to talk about how you can help bats, and I'm going to let Matt take over this slide.
Yes, so thank you, Georgia. Yes, so I get asked this question a lot, like, how can I help bats? How can, the typical person with their, let's say typical bat-sized backyard, how can they help bats? And so, a lot of people want to put up bat boxes, and the last thing that I want to do is discourage anyone from putting up a bat box. However, it's interesting because, earlier, you heard me talk about how bats are very adaptable and can roost in all kinds of different areas. However, bats at the same time are very finicky and picky about the kind of roosting sites they like. And they switch roosting sites often. So typically in a bat's territory, it has multiple roosting locations it uses, and every couple days, they kind of will hop around, say what we would call a nexus of roosting locations within, say, hypothetically a 5-acre area. And so a lot of times people will put up a bat box and then they don't get any residents, or they just get wasps, It's a great wasp box. So I just say that, don't be discouraged if you don't get bats in a bat box, because that's pretty common. A lot of times there are ways that you can there's resources online too where, talking about how you place a bat box and kind of how it's exposed to the sun, so you want sun heat to it, but you don't want too much because it'll be too hot for them. So there's all these little nuances there. So just know they might use your box, they might not. But from my perspective, I think that the most beneficial thing you can do for bats is just maintain native habitats and native trees. So, bats in general, I would say most species really like and depend upon mature trees, because that's where a lot of insects are. A lot of bats roost in trees. And so, you will typically, if you have good tree coverage, you will usually have good bat habitat. So maintaining good mature trees, planting native plants, maintaining native plants native to kind of your specific area in Oklahoma is really important. And bats also need water, and water is where insects concentrate, especially in the summertime. You'll have swarms of insects and bugs flying over water. So, ponds are really beneficial for bats. And so creeks and waterways, I talked about gray bats earlier. Gray bats are very dependent upon waterways in the summer because they forage on aquatic insects. So maintaining a diversity of habitat on your property and native habitat is the most important thing. And then of course, if you are fortunate enough to have an actual cave or a known roosting site on your property, just keeping it protected and not disturbing it during those sensitive periods. So the two most sensitive periods for bats are whenever they're raising their young. So during the lactation period, when the young, what are called pups, they can't fly and the mothers can't really move those pups around. It's usually a 2 to 3 week window during the summer. That's an extremely sensitive time period for bats, most bats I would say. And then in the winter, when they're in deep hibernation, they're very susceptible to disturbance. And so especially if they're in caves and if you go into caves when bats are hibernating, just be cognizant of that during those kind of sensitive windows. And with that, we are happy to take questions. Yes.
Thank you so much. Super, super
You're welcome.
helpful. This is sort of, I think, a question for Georgia in terms of the like tiered approach, and if they choose to do nothing, they still are legally responsible for the take.
Yes.
But is it correct to assume that there's really no way to determine if they have taken anything because it's private property?
Generally, yes. We do our best to act in good faith